The wagon lurched to a stop with a groan of wood and iron, sending up a cloud of dust that hung in the November air like a dirty veil. Annalise Rowan gripped the rough wooden rail, her knuckles white beneath travel-worn gloves. 3 days on the freight wagon from Cedar Falls had left her joints stiff and her back aching, but she straightened her spine as she always did, rising to her full height as she climbed down. Dust Creek spread before her like a painting left too long in the sun-faded storefronts, weathered signs, and streets that turned to mud with the first rain. The late afternoon light cast long shadows across the main thoroughfare, where a few townspeople paused their business to stare at the newcomer. She knew what they saw. At 5 feet and 10 inches, Annalise stood taller than most men in town. Her shoulders, broadened by years of farm work, filled out the simple traveling dress she'd sewn herself. Her hands, though clean, bore the calluses of someone who knew labor. She wasn't the delicate flower that graced the advertisements for mail-order brides in the Eastern newspapers. But Marcus Dalton had chosen her from those very advertisements. His letters had been practical, brief, speaking of his need for a sturdy woman who knows work. She'd written back honestly about her height, her strength, her experience with livestock and crops. He'd seemed pleased. Such qualities will serve well on a ranch. He'd written. Now, standing in the dusty street with her single trunk at her feet, Annalise searched the small crowd for the man who'd promised her a new life. She spotted him by the saloon, a man of middle years with a neat mustache, wearing the clothes of a prosperous rancher. Their eyes met across the street. Marcus Dalton's expression shifted from expectation to confusion, then to something that made her stomach drop like a stone in a well. He crossed the street slowly, his boots clicking on the packed earth. Up close, she could see the calculation in his eyes as he took in her height, her broad shoulders, the strong line of her jaw. "Miss Rowan," his voice carried doubt. "Mr. Dalton." She extended her hand as she'd been taught, but he didn't take it. "I thought you'd be—" He paused, his gaze traveling from her face to her feet and back again. "Smaller." The word hung between them like a gate swinging shut. Around them, she could feel the town watching, hear the whispers starting. A woman from the general store had stopped sweeping her stoop. 2 cowboys leaning against the saloon wall exchanged glances and low chuckles. "I wrote of my height," Annalise said quietly. "In my 3rd letter." "You wrote you were tall for a woman." His voice had turned cold, businesslike. "I didn't expect this." This, as if she were livestock that had arrived in poor condition, as if she were goods that could be refused at the depot. "I've come 3 days' journey," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "We have an understanding." Marcus shook his head, already stepping back. "No, this won't do. I need a wife, not a—" He stopped himself, but she could fill in the blank. Not a giant, not a spectacle, not someone who would make him look small standing beside her at church. "I have nowhere else to go." The words came out harder than she intended. "There's a boarding house on 3rd Street. Mrs. Henley might have a room." He was already turning away. "I'll have someone bring your trunk." Mr. Dalton." But he was walking away, his boots striking the ground with final, decisive sounds. The small crowd that had gathered began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others whispering behind raised hands. Annalise stood alone in the street, her trunk at her feet, her future scattered like seeds on stone. The boarding house on 3rd Street wanted $2 a night, money she didn't have after spending her last coins on the journey west. Mrs. Henley, a narrow woman with suspicious eyes, looked Annalise up and down and declared she had no rooms anyway. "Full up," she said, though Annalise could see empty windows above. The hotel was the same. The owner took one look at her and suddenly remembered a prior reservation. As the sun began to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose, Annalise found herself walking the edges of town, her trunk dragging behind her. Her good shoes, the ones she'd saved for meeting her intended, were dust-covered now, the hem of her dress gray with dirt. She passed houses with lit windows, families sitting down to supper. She passed the church, its doors firmly shut. At the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to rangeland, she stopped. The Dalton Ranch spread before her neat fences, well-maintained buildings, cattle dotting the distant fields, and there, set back from the main house and bunkhouse, stood an old barn, its doors hanging slightly open. Hay storage, from the look of it, half empty this late in the season. Pride warred with practicality. She'd slept in worse places during harvest season back home. At least here, she'd be dry if snow came. And it would come, she could smell it on the wind, that metallic tang that promised winter. She waited until full dark, until the lights in the ranch house dimmed and the bunkhouse grew quiet. Then she slipped through the fence, dragging her trunk through the grass, staying low though her height made true concealment impossible. The barn smelled of hay and horses, familiar scents that eased the knot in her chest. In the back corner, behind stacked bales, she found a space where loose hay had been piled. It would do. She opened her trunk carefully, pulling out the quilt her mother had made, the only fine thing she owned. Her fingers traced the careful stitches in the dark. Her mother had been tall too, though not quite as tall as Annalise. "Stand straight," she used to say. "God made you as he intended." But God's intentions seemed cruel tonight, in a barn that wasn't hers, in a town that had already decided she didn't belong. She unlaced her boots, setting them carefully aside. Her stockings were worn through at the heel, she'd need to darn them when there was light. She spread the quilt over the hay, fully dressed in her traveling clothes. Tomorrow, she'd have to decide what to do, where to go, but she had no money for the journey back, and no home to return to anyway. The farm had been sold to pay her father's debts. This marriage was supposed to be her new beginning. She lay back on the makeshift bed, looking up at the rafters where moonlight leaked through gaps in the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a cow lowed. Closer, she could hear mice rustling in the hay. Normal sounds, safe sounds, better than the whispers of townspeople or the cold finality in Marcus Dalton's voice. Her eyes were just closing when she heard footsteps outside the barn. Slow, measured, coming closer. She held her breath, pressing herself deeper into the hay. Had someone seen her enter, would they drag her out, humiliate her further? The barn door creaked open wider. A silhouette filled the doorway. A man, tall and broad-shouldered himself, though the darkness hid his features. He stood there for a long moment, and she could feel him listening, looking. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Why are you sleeping here, ma'am?" Not accusatory, not angry, just curious, as if finding a woman in his hay barn was simply another puzzle to solve at the end of a long day. Annalise sat up slowly, hay clinging to her hair, dignity scattered like her carefully laid plans. In the moonlight, she could make out a weathered face beneath a wide-brimmed hat, eyes that seemed more tired than unkind. She stopped. What could she say that she'd been rejected like poor merchandise, that the town had closed its doors to her, that she had nowhere else to go? The man waited, patient as stone. Behind him, snow began to fall, the first flakes of winter drifting through the dark like tiny promises or tiny threats, she couldn't tell which anymore. The man stepped back from the doorway, giving her space to gather herself. Annalise brushed the hay from her hair with as much dignity as she could muster, though she knew how she must look disheveled, desperate, caught where she had no right to be. "I apologize," she began, her voice hoarse from the day's trials. "I meant no harm. I'll leave at first light." "That's not what I asked." His voice remained steady, unhurried. He moved into the barn, closing the door behind him against the falling snow. In the better light, she could see him more clearly, a man perhaps 10 years her senior, with sun-weathered skin and hands that spoke of hard work. His coat was patched at the elbows, his boots worn but well-maintained. "I had nowhere else," she admitted, the truth easier than any lie she might construct. The boarding house was full, or so they said. He nodded slowly, as if this didn't surprise him. "You're the woman who came in on the freight wagon, the one Dalton was supposed to meet." Heat rose to her cheeks despite the cold, so everyone knew already. By tomorrow, the story would have grown the too-tall bride rejected right there in the street, now hiding in barns like a common vagrant. Yes, the single word carried all her humiliation. The man she still didn't know his name looked around the barn, taking in her makeshift bed, her carefully placed boots, the trunk that held everything she owned. His gaze lingered on the quilt, its pattern visible even in the dim light. "That's fine work," he said, nodding at the quilt. "You're making—" "My mother's." She touched the edge of it unconsciously. "She passed 3 winters ago." "I'm sorry for your loss." He meant it. She could hear it in his voice. Then, more practically, "The barn's no place for anyone tonight. Temperature's dropping fast. Snow's coming in earnest." Annalise pulled her shawl tighter, though it did little against the cold already seeping through the barn walls. "I'll manage. I've slept in worse places." "I don't doubt it." He studied her for a moment, and she resisted the urge to hunch her shoulders, to make herself smaller. "But there's no need for it tonight. I've got a cabin about a quarter-mile north. Kitchen's still warm. You could sit by the stove for a while. Warm up, at least." She stiffened. A single woman didn't go to a strange man's cabin. Not if she valued her reputation. Although what reputation did she have left still? She'd rather freeze than invite further scandal. He seemed to read her thoughts. "I'm Wesley Calder. Folks call me Wes. I manage the northern section of Dalton's spread. Been here 6 years come spring." He paused. "I've got coffee on the stove and leftover stew that's better than anything you'll find in town. You can leave whenever you like." The offer hung in the air between them. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the barn walls. Her feet were already numb in her worn boots, her fingers stiff with cold. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not tonight. "Just to warm up," she said finally. He nodded and turned toward the door. "Bring your things. This barn's not secure. Cowboys come and go at all hours." She gathered her trunk, struggling slightly with its weight on the uneven ground. Without a word, Wes took one end, and together they carried it out into the snowy night. He didn't comment on its heaviness or her strength in managing it. He simply helped, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The walk to his cabin was silent, except for the crunch of snow under their boots. The flakes fell thicker now, already covering the ground in a thin white blanket. In the distance, she could see a small structure with light glowing in one window, a beacon in the darkness. The cabin was exactly what she'd expected from a working cowboy functional. Clean, sparse. One main room served as kitchen and living space, with a lean-to addition that likely held a bed. The stove radiated blessed warmth, and true to his word, a coffee pot sat on top, wisps of steam escaping from the spout. "Sit," he said, indicating a wooden chair near the stove. "I'll pour you something hot." She sat carefully, aware of how she filled the space. Everything in the cabin was built for someone his size, and he wasn't a small man. For once, she didn't feel like she was about to break something simply by existing. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it warmed her from the inside out. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup, letting the heat seep into her frozen fingers. Wes moved about the small space with easy familiarity, ladling stew into a bowl and setting it before her without ceremony. "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate. "Eat," he said simply, pouring his own coffee and sitting across from her. "Then we'll figure out what's to be done." The stew was simple beef, potatoes, carrots, but well-seasoned and filling. She ate slowly, partly from manners and partly to make the warmth last. Wes didn't press her with questions, didn't fill the silence with empty talk. He sipped his coffee and gazed out the window at the falling snow. "I should have known," she said finally, setting down her spoon. "I should have realized when his letters were so brief, so practical. He never asked about my thoughts or dreams, only about my skills. Man wanted a workhorse, not a wife," Wes observed. Yes. The baldness of it stung, but it was true. And when the workhorse turned out to be a Clydesdale instead of a quarter horse, he changed his mind. A slight smile tugged at Wes's mouth. "Nothing wrong with Clydesdales. Strong, steady, dependable. Worth their weight in gold to a man who knows their value." She looked at him sharply, searching for mockery, but found none. He was studying his coffee cup as if it held answers. "Most men prefer delicate flowers," she said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Most men are fools." He looked up then, meeting her eyes directly. "Delicate flowers don't last out here. First hard frost kills them dead." They sat in silence again, but it was a different sort of silence, companionable rather than awkward. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind howled. But inside the cabin was an island of warmth and calm. "I can't go back to the barn," she said eventually. "Not tonight." "Wasn't planning to let you." He stood, moving to a wooden chest in the corner. "Question is what to do with you proper-like." She tensed, but he was already pulling out blankets and a worn but clean pillow. "There's a lean-to storage room off the back," he said. "Used to be where I slept when I first came here, before I built the addition. It's rough, but it's got a small stove of its own, warmer than the barn by far. And private. You could stay there tonight. Figure out your plans come morning." "I couldn't impose." "Not an imposition." He cut her off gently. "Room's sitting empty anyway. Been meaning to clear it out but never found the time. Might as well get some use." He led her through a narrow door into the lean-to. It was small but clean, with a narrow cot against one wall and a pot-bellied stove in the corner. Wooden shelves held various supplies rope, leather for repairs, boxes of ammunition. A single window looked out onto the snow-covered prairie. "It's not fancy," he said, almost apologetically. "It's perfect." She meant it. After the barn, after the rejection, after everything, this simple room felt like a palace. "I don't know how to thank you." "No thanks needed." He set the blankets on the cot. "I'll get the stove going. There's a water pitcher and basin on the shelf there, and the outhouse is just behind the main cabin. I rise early around 4 usually, but you sleep as long as you need." He knelt by the small stove, feeding it kindling with practiced movements. Soon it was crackling merrily, adding its warmth to the room. He straightened, dusting off his hands. "Mr. Calder, Wes, why are you doing this?" He paused at the door, considering. Maybe because I know what it's like to have nowhere to go. Maybe because turning someone out in a snowstorm sits wrong with me. Or maybe... He shrugged. "Maybe I just think Dalton's a fool, and I don't like seeing good people pay for other folks' foolishness." With that, he was gone, closing the door softly behind him. Annalise stood in the middle of the small room, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. She'd prepared herself for cruelty, for hardship, for struggle. She hadn't prepared for this simple, unsentimental compassion from a stranger. She unpacked slowly, hanging her few dresses on nails in the wall. Her mother's quilt looked right spread on the narrow cot. She unlaced her boots properly this time and set them by the stove to dry. Her feet ached as feeling returned to them. Through the thin wall, she could hear Wes moving about in the main cabin, the ordinary sounds of a man preparing for bed. It was oddly comforting, knowing she wasn't alone in the storm. She changed into her nightgown, a practical flannel thing that covered her from neck to ankles. As she brushed out her hair, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror hung on the wall. Tall, broad-shouldered, strong-jawed. Not beautiful by any standard she'd ever heard, but alive, warm, safe, at least for tonight. She climbed into the narrow cot, pulling the blankets up to her chin. The stove crackled softly, and outside the wind continued its assault on the prairie. But here, in this small, borrowed room, she was protected. For the first time since stepping off that freight wagon, Annalise allowed herself to feel the full weight of the day, the humiliation, the fear, the desperate scramble for shelter. And now this unexpected refuge offered without condition or expectation. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She had no money, no prospects, no plan beyond surviving the night. But somehow, that seemed enough for now. Tomorrow she would figure out the rest. Tonight, she would sleep warm and dry, treated with more dignity by a stranger than by the man who'd promised to marry her. The barn had been cold but familiar, a place to hide and lick her wounds. But this small act of kindness from a weathered cowboy, this was something else entirely, not charity, exactly, more like recognition. One outsider acknowledging another, perhaps through the wall. She heard the larger stove being banked for the night, then footsteps moving to the addition where Wes slept, then silence, except for the wind and snow. Annalise closed her eyes, letting exhaustion finally claim her. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it standing tall. Tonight, she didn't have to make herself small. Tonight, in a borrowed room with a warm stove and clean blankets, she could simply be. Annalise woke to the sound of movement in the main cabin, quiet, deliberate sounds of someone trying not to disturb. Gray light filtered through the frosted window, suggesting dawn was still an hour away. True to his word, Wes was an early riser. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself. The small stove had burned low during the night but still radiated warmth. Her body ached from the previous day's trials, but she was warm, dry, and safe. It seemed almost miraculous. Rising quietly, she dressed in her simplest work dress, dark blue wool that had seen better days but was clean and serviceable. She pinned her hair back severely, washed her face in the cold water from the basin, and steeled herself to face whatever this day might bring. When she emerged from the lean-to, Wes was at the stove, tending a skillet of eggs and salt pork. He glanced up at her entrance, nodding a greeting. "Coffee's hot," he said simply. "Breakfast in a few minutes." "You didn't need to." "Man's gotta eat before work. Made enough for two." He gestured to the chair she'd occupied the night before. "Sit." She sat, accepting the coffee gratefully. In the growing light, she could see the cabin more clearly. Everything was neat, orderly, but worn mended harness hanging on pegs. Boots lined up by the door. A rifle propped in the corner. A man's space, functional and without ornament, except for one thing, a small daguerreotype on a shelf, showing a younger Wes standing beside a woman and small child. He noticed her glance but didn't comment, focusing on sliding eggs onto 2 tin plates. He set one before her along with a thick slice of bread. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. I'll be on my way after." "Where?" He sat across from her with his own plate. "Where will you go?" The question hung heavy. She had no answer. "I'll find work," she said finally. "In town, perhaps, or at one of the other ranches." "In Dust Creek." He shook his head slightly. "Word's already spread about yesterday. Dalton's got influence. Most folks won't go against him." The eggs turned tasteless in her mouth, but she forced herself to swallow. He was right, of course. She'd seen how quickly the town had closed ranks. "Then I'll go to another town." With what money, stage costs $5 to the nearest settlement. More to go farther. She set down her fork, her appetite gone. "Then what would you suggest, Mr. Calder, since you seem to have thought this through?" If her sharp tone bothered him, he didn't show it. He continued eating methodically, thinking. "I need help," he said finally. "Been needing it for a while. This section of the ranch runs about 300 head, plus horses. Too much for one man, but Dalton won't hire extra hands for the north section. Says it's not profitable enough." She frowned. "I don't understand what—" "I can't pay wages. Don't have that authority, but I can offer room and board. The lean-to's yours as long as you need it. In exchange, you help with what needs doing. Cooking, mending, maybe helping with the stock when needed. Give you time to figure out your next move without freezing or starving. Annalise stared at him. You're offering me a position, but you don't know anything about me. Know you're in a hard spot through no fault of your own. Know you're practical enough to shelter where you could find it. Know you didn't complain once about the cold or the accommodations. He shrugged. That's enough for now. People will talk. People always talk. Let them. She considered it. The offer was unconventional. Certainly, a single woman working for a single man, even with separate quarters, would set tongues wagging, but what choice did she have? Pride wouldn't keep her warm or fed. I'm a hard worker, she said carefully. I can cook, clean, mend. I know horses and cattle helped raise them back home. I can shoot if needed, and I'm not afraid of rough work. Figured as much. He pushed back from the table. I've got to check the stock. Make sure they weathered the storm. Think on it. I'll be back by midday. He pulled on his coat and hat, wrapping a muffler around his neck. At the door, he paused. That daguerreotype, he said without turning. My wife and daughter. Fever took them 4 years back. Just so you know, there's nothing improper in my offer. I'm not looking for a wife, just help. Then he was gone, leaving Annalise alone with her thoughts and the cooling breakfast. She rose and cleared the dishes, washing them in the basin and setting them to dry. The simple domesticity of it felt strange after yesterday's chaos. Through the window, she watched West disappear into the swirling snow, shoulders bent against the wind. His offer was generous, more than generous. Room, board, and time to plan her future. No expectations beyond honest work. After Marcus Dalton's cold rejection, such straightforward decency seemed almost suspect. But what trap could there be? He'd already had her at his mercy last night and had acted with perfect propriety. She explored the cabin more thoroughly, partly from curiosity and partly from a need to understand this man who'd offered her sanctuary. The main room was sparse but clean. A few books sat on a shelf, a Bible, an almanac, what looked like a veterinary guide. The addition door was closed, and she didn't presume to enter his private space. In her own small room, she unpacked more fully, hanging her good dress, the one she'd planned to wear to her wedding, on a peg at the bottom of her trunk. Wrapped carefully in paper, lay her few treasures, her mother's silver brush, a small sewing kit, and a leather-bound journal she'd barely written in. She opened the journal to the last entry, dated the day before she'd left home. Tomorrow I begin my journey to a new life. Mr. Dalton seems a practical man, which suits me. I do not expect romance or poetry. Only respect and partnership. Perhaps in time, affection will grow. I am not a woman made for fairy tales, but I hope for contentment at least. How naive she'd been. Not even contentment had been waiting for her. Only humiliation and rejection. She closed the journal and moved to the window. The snow had lessened, revealing a white blanketed landscape that stretched endlessly. Somewhere out there, cattle huddled against the storm. And somewhere, a man who'd taken her in without question was checking on their welfare. By the time Wes returned, she'd made her decision. She met him at the door, taking his snow-covered coat and hanging it by the stove to dry. I accept your offer, she said without preamble. Room and board in exchange for work, but I have conditions. He raised an eyebrow, warming his hands at the stove. Oh, I keep my own space. The lean-to remains mine alone. I'll work sunrise to sunset, but my evenings are my own unless there's an emergency. And if I find other employment or choose to leave, you won't stand in my way. Fair enough. He seemed amused by her businesslike approach. Anything else? I'll need supplies for the kitchen if I'm to cook proper meals, and access to mending materials for clothes and tack. There's credit at Morrison's general store in town. Put what you need on my account. She hesitated. After yesterday, they might not serve me. They'll serve you if you're shopping for me. Jim Morrison's too fond of money to turn away business. He moved to the table, pulling out a piece of paper and a pencil. I'll write you a note to show them. As he wrote, she studied him. His hands were steady, his writing surprisingly neat for a cowboy. There was something solid about him, unchangeable as rock. After the shifting sands of yesterday, that steadiness drew her. There! He handed her the paper. That should do it. Storms letting up might be a good time to go while the roads are passable. She looked outside dubiously. You're sure it's safe? I'll hitch up the wagon, drive you in myself. Need to pick up feed anyway. He paused. Unless you'd rather not be seen with me. Might add to the talk. Mr. Calder Wes. I'm a woman who spent last night unchaperoned in a man's cabin. My reputation is already ruined. Being seen conducting honest business can hardly make it worse. Practical, he observed. I like that. The ride to town was cold, but not unpleasant. Wes handled the horses with easy competence, navigating the snow-covered road. They spoke little, but the silence was comfortable. Annalise found herself stealing glances at his profile, weathered. Unremarkable, but kind. When was the last time anyone had been simply kind to her without wanting something in return? Dust Creek looked different in the snow cleaner. Somehow, its shabby edges softened, but the stairs were the same as she climbed down from the wagon. She heard the whispers start immediately. That's her, the one Dalton rejected. Living with Wes Calder now. I heard, bold as brass, showing her face. She kept her chin up, following Wes into Morrison's store. The interior was warm and cluttered, smelling of pickle brine and leather. Jim Morrison, a thin man with calculating eyes, looked up from his ledger. Wes, he greeted cautiously, eyes sliding to Annalise. Ma'am? Miss Rowan's helping me out at the north section. Wes said calmly, she'll be getting supplies on my account. Morrison's eyes sharpened with interest. That's so well. Any friend of yours? Wes. The shopping was accomplished quickly. Annalise selected basic supplies, flour, salt pork, beans, coffee, canned goods. She added needles, thread, and patches for mending. When Morrison tallied the bill, she saw Wes nod approval. Anything else you need? Morrison asked, clearly hoping for more business. Writing paper, she said impulsively, and ink, if you have it. Course I do. He produced both, adding them to the pile. Planning to write letters. Miss Rowan. She met his prying gaze steadily. Perhaps. Outside, loading the supplies, Wes said quietly. You handled that well. I've been handling whispers and stares all my life, she replied. Being tall makes you conspicuous. Being rejected just adds flavor to the gossip. Does it bother you? She considered lying, then decided against it. Yes, but not enough to hide. He nodded, seeming to file this away. They made one more stop, the feed store, where the reaction was similar. Curiosity, calculation, but willingness to take Wes's money. By the time they headed back to the ranch, the sun was high and the snow was starting to melt in patches. Thank you, she said as the cabin came into view. For the chance. For not what? For not looking at me like I'm a problem to be solved or a curiosity to be examined. For just treating me like a person. He pulled up the horses, turning to look at her directly. Miss Rowan Annalise, you're doing me a favor. Ranch works hard with one pair of hands. Having help, even temporary help, makes my life easier. No charity in it, just practical sense. But she saw something in his eyes that suggested it wasn't quite that simple. Still, she appreciated the fiction. It let them both maintain their dignity. That evening, she cooked her first meal in her new position, nothing fancy, just beans with salt pork and cornbread, but properly seasoned and filling. Wes ate with apparent appreciation, complimenting the cornbread particularly. Haven't had decent cornbread in years. He admitted, not since... He didn't finish, but she could fill in the blank. Not since his wife died. After supper, she retired to her room as agreed, leaving him to his evening. Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving about, then the scrape of a chair and the rustle of pages. Reading, perhaps. She lit her own lamp and pulled out the paper and ink. At the top of a clean sheet, she wrote the date, then paused. Who was she writing to? She had no family left, few friends who'd care about her circumstances. Finally, she began. I find myself in unexpected circumstances. The marriage I traveled so far to make has dissolved before it began. Yet, in the dissolution, I have discovered something else, that kindness exists in unlikely places, that dignity can be maintained even in difficult times, and that perhaps being rejected was not the ending I feared, but a beginning I never expected. She set down the pen, reading over the words. They seemed too optimistic for a woman sleeping in a lean-to, working for board and room, yet they felt true. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the night crisp and still. Through her window, she could see stars emerging between the clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, lonely but defiant. She prepared for bed, her movements already falling into a routine. Tomorrow there would be work, real work, honest work. Not the life she'd imagined, but life nonetheless. The cabin light was soft in her window, a warm glow against the darkness. And for the first time since stepping off that freight wagon, Annalise felt something that might have been hope. The first week passed in a rhythm of simple tasks and quiet evenings. Annalise rose before dawn to start the stove and prepare breakfast, timing it so the coffee was hot when Wes returned from his early check on the stock. They ate in companionable silence. Then he would head out for the day's work while she tended to the cabin and prepared the midday meal. It was during these evening hours, after supper was cleared and she had retired to her room, that a different pattern emerged. Wes would settle at the table with a lamp, but instead of reading, he would work on various repairs bridles that needed mending, boots that required new soles, torn clothing that had been neglected too long. On the fourth evening, watching through her partially open door as he struggled to thread a needle in the lamplight, Annalise could stand it no longer. "You'll ruin your eyes," she said, stepping into the main room. He looked up, squinting. "Needs doing." "Give it here." She held out her hand. "It's not part of our agreement. Neither is watching you go blind from squinting." She took the shirt from him, examining the tear. "This needs proper mending, not just pulling the edges together." She fetched her sewing kit and settled in the chair across from him. The tear was clean, probably from catching on a fence nail. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency, making small, even stitches that would hold without puckering the fabric. "You're good at that," he observed. "Years of practice. My father believed idle hands were the devil's playground. When I wasn't working the farm, I was mending or making." She held the needle up to the light, threading it with ease. These hands were never meant to be decorative. "Useful is better than decorative out here." She glanced at him. "That's what I thought, Marcus, mister. Dalton understood from my letters. I was clear about who I was, what I could offer. Men see what they want to see, read what they want to read." Wes leaned back in his chair. "Probably pictured you different in his mind, no matter what you wrote. Did you ever consider it a mail-order bride?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. His face shuddered slightly. "No. Had everything I needed once. Didn't see the point in trying to replace what couldn't be replaced." She bent back to her work, recognizing the boundary. They sat in silence while she finished the shirt, then started on a pair of work pants with a torn knee. "I can do those later," he began. "I'm already set up. Besides, you'll just make a mess of it." She smiled to soften the words. "Tell me about the ranch instead. How many head did you say?" And so they fell into conversation. Real conversation for the first time. Wes spoke of cattle prices, The challenge of finding good grazing in drought years. His plans for improving the bloodline with a new bull come spring. His voice changed when he talked about the work becoming animated, engaged.
Dalton doesn't see it, he said, frustration creeping in. Thinks the north section's just overflow grazing, but the grass up here is better, hardier. The creek runs year-round, with proper management. Could run twice the head.
Why doesn't he listen? Because I'm hired help, not a partner, and because... He hesitated. Because I told him he was a fool once. Early on. Man doesn't forget that kind of thing. What did he do to earn the title? A slight smile crossed Wes's weathered face. Wanted to sell off 50 head of pregnant cows right before calving season. Said they were eating too much without producing. Couldn't see past the immediate cost to the future profit. But that's foolish. Yes, told him so, too. Saved the cattle, but earned his grudge. He shrugged. Worth it. Those calves made the ranch's profit that year. Annalise finished the pants and reached for another item from his mending pile, a jacket with a torn pocket. You could work elsewhere. Surely other ranches would value your experience. Could, but I've got investment here beyond wages. Know every stream, every pasture. Helped birth half the herd, and... He gestured vaguely toward the window. Mary's buried on the hill overlooking the valley. Can see it from the north pasture. Wouldn't feel right. Leaving. Mary, his wife's name, spoken aloud for the first time. Annalise kept her eyes on her stitching, allowing him the privacy of grief. Tell me about the farm, he said after a moment, clearly wanting to shift the subject. Your family's place. So she did, describing the small homestead in Illinois, the constant battle against weather and worn-out soil. She told him about her 3 brothers who'd gone west to California, seeking gold and finding only hard labor, about her mother's death and her father's slow decline, the debts that mounted until there was nothing left but sale or loss. The bank took it 2 days after we buried him, she said, tying off the final stitch. I answered Mr. Dalton's advertisement the same week. Seemed like Providence at the time. Maybe it was, just not the way you expected. She looked up at him, startled by the observation. He was watching her steadily, no pity in his gaze, just understanding. Maybe, she agreed softly. It became their routine after that. Evenings by the stove, her hands busy with mending while they talked. Or rather, while she drew him out with questions and he slowly, carefully, shared pieces of his life. She learned that he'd come from Texas originally, following the cattle drives north until he'd saved enough to dream of his own place, that he'd met Mary in Kansas, a schoolteacher who'd scandalized her family by marrying a cowboy, that their daughter, Emma, had been 3 when the fever came. Bright as a button, he said one evening, staring into the fire. Always asking questions. Why is the sky blue? Papa, where do the stars go in daytime? Mary used to say she'd either be a teacher or a scientist. Way her mind worked. You would have been proud of her. Was proud of her. Am proud of her. Death doesn't change that. In return, Annalise found herself sharing more than she'd intended, about the weight of being the only daughter after her brothers left, expected to be both helpmate and caretaker, about the suitors who'd come calling until they'd stood next to her and realized she could look them in the eye or down at them. One told me I was too much woman, she said, laughing bitterly. Never did figure out how a person could be too much of what they were born to be. Can't be too much of yourself, Wes said firmly. Can only be yourself or pretend to be less. Pretending's what kills you, out here. One evening, a week into their arrangement, she noticed him favoring his left hand at dinner. What happened? Nothing. Caught it between a post and a stubborn cow. It's fine. But she could see the swelling, the way he couldn't quite close his fingers, without asking permission. She took his hand in both of hers, examining it carefully. His palm was calloused, scarred from years of rope work, but the fingers were definitely swollen. This needs wrapping, and cold. She rose, moving to the door. I'll get snow. Annalise, it's... but she was already outside, scooping clean snow into a basin. When she returned, she wrapped the snow in a cloth and pressed it to his hand, then began winding strips of fabric to hold it in place. "You're doctoring me now," but his protest was mild. "Someone needs to. You'd let it swell until you couldn't work, then blame yourself for the weakness." She tied off the bandage neatly. "Keep that elevated tonight. I'll rewrap it in the morning." He flexed his fingers experimentally. The support clearly helped, though she could see he'd never admit it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's what partners do," she replied without thinking, then flushed at the word choice. "I mean work partners, people who work together. I know what you meant." But something had shifted in that moment. Some invisible line crossed. They were more than employer and hired help now, more than two people sharing space out of necessity. They were what friends companions. The next evening, when she entered the main room after supper, she found he'd pulled a second chair closer to the fire and placed her sewing basket beside it. "Thought you might be more comfortable," he said gruffly. "Better light here." She sat without comment, picking up his latest torn shirt. But inside, something warm unfurled in her chest. Such a small gesture, pulling up a chair, but it meant she was welcome, expected even. Part of the evening routine now, not just tolerated but anticipated. They talked more freely now, the careful boundaries of the first week relaxing. Wes told her about his plans for the spring, a better chicken coop, expanding the garden plot, maybe adding a root cellar. "You're planning to stay," she observed. "Been here 6 years. No reason to leave now." He paused. "Unless Dalton finally fires me for insubordination." "Would he?" "Maybe. Probably not. I know the land too well. Work too cheap." His smile was wry. Man knows a bargain, even if he doesn't like it. "And me," she kept her eyes on her stitching. "Am I a bargain too?" "No." His answer was immediate, firm. "You're a gift I didn't know I needed." The words hung in the air between them. Annalise's needle stilled. When she looked up, he was staring into the fire, his profile etched by the flickering light. "I mean, the help," he clarified quickly. "The cooking and mending and the company. Gets quiet out here alone." "Yes," she agreed softly. "It does." Later, in her room, she thought about those words. A gift. When was the last time anyone had seen her that way? Not as too tall, too strong, too much, but as a gift. She pulled out her journal, writing by lamplight. "I'm learning that kindness can grow in the space between two people who expect nothing from each other. That conversation can be better than courtship, and comfortable silence better than flowery words. I came here to be a wife, and found myself becoming something else myself. Perhaps the self I might have been if the world hadn't insisted I try to be smaller. Wes sees me as I am, and finds value there. Not romantic value, he's careful to maintain that boundary, and I'm grateful for it. But human value, worth beyond measurement or comparison. It's a strange feeling, being valued for simply being present and capable. I could grow used to it." She set down her pen, listening to the familiar sounds of Wes banking the fire for the night. Tomorrow would bring more work, more quiet conversation, more small moments of recognition between two people who'd found unexpected companionship in their solitude. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but increasingly, she couldn't imagine wanting any other. The morning Annalise discovered Wes's torn coat was the morning everything began to shift. She'd gone to the lean-to to fetch extra firewood and found it hanging on a nail, his heavy winter coat, the one he wore every day, with a rip from shoulder to mid-back that had been crudely tied together with leather strips. She carried it into the main cabin where he was finishing his coffee. "How long have you been wearing this disaster?" She held up the coat accusingly. He barely glanced at it. "Works fine. Keeps the wind out mostly." Wesley called her. "This is beyond mending. This needs reconstruction." She examined the damage more closely. The fabric was good quality wool, just neglected. When did this happen? Month ago, maybe 2. Caught it on a broken gate. He shrugged. Been meaning to fix it proper. Take off your shirt. He nearly choked on his coffee. Pardon? I need to measure you. This needs more than mending, it needs reshaping. And I'll need to know your measurements to do it right. She was already pulling out her measuring tape. All business. Unless you prefer to freeze when the real cold hits. He stood reluctantly, pulling off his outer shirt to reveal the worn union suit beneath. Annalise had seen men in their underclothes before 3 brothers didn't allow for excessive modesty, but something about the domestic intimacy of the moment made her pulse quicken. She kept her manner brisk, professional. Arms out. He complied, and she wrapped the tape around his chest, his shoulders, the length of his arms. He stood very still, and she was aware of his breathing, the warmth radiating from him in the cool morning air. His build was solid, strong from years of physical work, and she found herself noticing the way his shoulders curved, the breadth of his back. There, she said, stepping back perhaps more quickly than necessary. You can put your shirt back on. As he dressed, she studied the coat with new eyes. I'll need heavy thread, maybe some leather for reinforcement. And extra fabric, do you have anything stored away? There's a trunk in the addition, he said after a moment. Mary's things, some fabric she never got to use. You're welcome to it if it helps. It was the first time he'd offered anything from his past life. Annalise understood the weight of the gesture. I'll be careful with it, she promised. He nodded and headed out to work, leaving her with the coat and the permission to enter his most private space. The addition was simple, a bed, a washstand, the trunk at the foot of the bed. On the small table beside the bed sat the daguerreotype she'd glimpsed before, and a dried wildflower in a small glass. Otherwise, the room was as spare as the rest of the cabin. Annalise opened the trunk carefully. The scent of lavender rose from within, preserved in sachets tucked among the contents. There were dresses she didn't disturb, but beneath them lay folded lengths of fabric-good wool, sturdy cotton, even some oiled cloth that would be perfect for reinforcing. At the bottom, wrapped in paper, was something that made her breath catch. A quilt, pieced in a wedding ring pattern, the stitching fine and even. Clearly Mary's work, probably meant for the bed she'd never sleep in again. Annalise closed the trunk gently, taking only what she needed for the coat, but the quilt stayed in her mind as she worked through the morning, carefully taking apart the damaged coat and planning its reconstruction. By afternoon, she had the pieces laid out on the table, a puzzle of fabric and possibility. She was so absorbed that she didn't hear Wes return until he spoke from the doorway. Looks like you're building a whole new coat. Near enough. She didn't look up from her pinning. The back panel was beyond saving, but with this extra fabric, I can replace it entirely. It'll be stronger than before. He moved closer, watching her work. You know tailoring. My mother taught me, said a woman who could make and mend would never go hungry. She carefully aligned a seam. Course, she probably didn't imagine I'd be using it to keep cowboys from freezing. Lucky for this cowboy. He pulled out the other chair without being asked, settling in to watch. Need help? Can you cut a straight line? Been known to. She handed him the shears and showed him where to cut. They worked together through the afternoon, her directing, him following instructions without complaint. The domesticity of it sharing a task, working toward a common goal created a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. You could have been a seamstress, he observed, watching her neat stitches. In a city, done this professional. Maybe, but I'd have been bent over tiny stitches in poor light, working for pennies. She threaded her needle with practiced ease. Here, I choose what I mend and when that's worth something. Freedom, he agreed. Worth everything, really. As the coat took shape, they talked more freely than ever before. Wes told her about winter preparations needed hay to be checked, weak spots in the barn to be reinforced, wood to be split and stacked, without thinking. Annalise found herself saying we when discussing the work ahead.
"We should check the chicken coop roof before snow,"
she said, then caught herself.
"I mean, you should."
"We was right the first time." He didn't look at her as he said it, focusing on cutting a careful line. "You're part of this place now. Makes sense to plan together." The words settled into her chest, warm and solid. As evening approached, the coat was nearly finished. Annalise held it up, examining her work critically. The new back panel was seamlessly integrated, reinforced at stress points, the whole garment stronger and warmer than before. "Try it on," she instructed. Wes slipped into the coat, and it fit perfectly. He moved his arms, testing the range of motion, and smiled a real smile that transformed his weathered face.
"It's better than new, warmer, too."
"The extra layer adds insulation, and I reinforced the shoulders and elbows should hold up better now." He ran his hands over the mended areas, and his expression grew thoughtful. "Mary would have liked you," he said suddenly. She appreciated folks who could make things better instead of just replacing them. Annalise felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly.
Thank you."
He shrugged out of the coat, hanging it carefully on the peg. "No, thank you, for this, and, he gestured vaguely, for making this place feel less empty." They prepared supper together, moving around each other with increasing ease. When she reached for the plates at the same time he did, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away immediately. The touch was brief, accidental, but it lingered in the air between them like a question. After supper, instead of retiring to her room, Annalise found herself lingering. Wes had brought out the veterinary guide, frowning over a section about hoof rot. "Problem?" she asked. "Maybe. Noticed one of the horses favoring his front left today. Want to be prepared if it's starting."
"May I?"
She held out her hand for the book. He passed it over, and she studied the diagrams.
"My father dealt with this. You need copper sulfate solution, and keep the hoof dry easier said than done with snow coming."
They bent over the book together, her pointing out relevant passages, him asking questions. Their heads were close, and she could smell the outdoor scent of him, leather and hay and cold air. When he turned to ask something, his face was inches from hers. They both froze, suddenly aware of the proximity. Annalise could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, the lines carved by sun and sorrow. For a heartbeat, the air between them shifted, charged with possibility. Then Wes pulled back, clearing his throat. "It's late. You should get some rest."
"Yes,"
she agreed, though neither moved immediately. Finally, she stood, gathering her composure. "Good night, Wes."
"Good night, Annalise."
In her room, she sat on the narrow bed, heart still racing. What had that been? A moment of awareness, simple proximity, creating false intimacy. She pressed her hands to her warm cheeks, trying to make sense of the flutter in her chest. She'd come here for a marriage of convenience and found instead, what friendship? Certainly, partnership. Yes, but that moment by the book had felt like something more. Something she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she was ready for. Through the wall, she could hear Wes moving about, the familiar sounds of his nightly routine, but tonight they seemed different, more present somehow. She was aware of him in a way she hadn't been before, not just as her benefactor or employer, but as a man, a good man, steady and kind, who looked at her work with appreciation and spoke to her as an equal. She pulled out her journal but found herself staring at the blank page. How could she put into words what she didn't understand herself finally? She wrote, "Today I mended more than a coat. Each stitch seemed to pull together not just fabric but the edges of two lives that had been torn by loss. We worked as partners, easy in each other's company, and for a moment I forgot to be careful. For a moment, I simply was a woman sitting close to a man, aware of his warmth and his presence in a way that had nothing to do with gratitude or convenience. I don't know what this means. We both carry too much history to rush toward anything.
But something is building here, stitch by stitch, day by day. Something that might, if we let it, become its own kind of strength. She closed the journal and prepared for bed, hanging her work dress carefully on the peg. Tomorrow she would start on the ranch hands mending. Word had spread that she could make old things new, and already a pile was growing by the door. Real work, appreciated and needed. As she lay down, she could see through her small window that the stars were bright in the clear sky. No snow tonight, but it would come soon. And when it did, Wes would be warm in his mended coat, carrying a piece of her work with him into the cold. The thought shouldn't have pleased her as much as it did. But alone in the dark, she allowed herself a small smile. She was building something here, not the life she'd planned, but perhaps the life she was meant to have. One careful stitch at a time. The annual harvest dance was 3 weeks away when news of it reached the cabin. Wes had returned from town with supplies and mentioned it almost as an afterthought while unpacking. Morrison says the town council's determined to go ahead with the dance this year, despite the early snow. He set canned goods on the shelf with careful precision. Apparently, they need something to lift spirits after a hard harvest. Annalise continued kneading bread dough, not looking up. That will be nice for the townspeople. She felt rather than saw him glance at her. In the month since she'd arrived, she'd ventured to town only for necessary supplies, enduring stares and whispers with practiced dignity. The thought of a social gathering, of all those eyes on her in a festive setting, made her stomach clench. The subject dropped, but over the following days, she noticed Wes watching her more often, a thoughtful expression on his face. Finally, one evening as she hemmed a pair of work pants, he spoke. "I've been thinking about the dance." Her needle paused for just a moment. "Oh, haven't been to one since—" He cleared his throat. "Well, in years, but I was thinking maybe it's time." She kept her eyes on her stitching. "You should go then. I can manage things here for an evening." "I meant we should go." The needle pricked her finger. She quickly brought it to her mouth, using the moment to compose herself. "Wes, I don't think—" "Hear me out." He leaned forward in his chair. "You've been cooped up here for weeks. Town's going to talk regardless. Might as well give them something true to talk about instead of letting them make up stories." "The true story isn't much better," she said quietly. "Rejected bride taken in by a widowed rancher. I know what they're saying." "Do you care what they say?" She considered this. "I thought I didn't, but the idea of walking into that hall, all those faces turning to stare." "You won't be walking in alone." His voice was firm. "I'm not much of a dancer. Mary used to tease me about having 2 left feet, but I know the basic steps, and I can keep time to music." "Why does this matter to you?" She finally looked up at him. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because you matter. Because you shouldn't have to hide. Because—" He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Because I'd like to take a friend to a dance. Is that so strange?" Friend. The word was safe, comfortable. But was that really what they were now? These past weeks had been filled with small intimacies, shared meals, evening conversations, the dozen tiny ways they'd learned to move around each other. More than friends, perhaps, but neither ready to name it anything else. "I don't have anything to wear," she said finally. A small smile tugged at his mouth. "I think we both know that's not true. I've seen that green dress hanging in your room." The dress she'd made for her wedding. She'd hung it up that first week and tried not to look at it, a reminder of failed plans. But it was beautiful deep green wool she'd saved for months to buy, carefully fitted to her tall frame. "That's my wedding dress." "No," he corrected gently. "That's a dress you made for a wedding that didn't happen. Seems a shame to let good work go to waste because of a fool's decision." She found herself smiling despite her anxiety. "You're very persistent, Mr. Calder." "So I've been told, usually about less pleasant things than dances." He stood, moving to the stove to pour coffee. "Think about it. You don't have to decide tonight."
But she'd already decided. She realized, the moment he'd said she mattered, something had shifted in her chest. She'd spent her whole life being too much for spaces she tried to fit into. Maybe it was time to stop trying to fit and simply take up the space she needed. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll go." The look on his face, surprise melting into genuine pleasure, was worth the fear fluttering in her stomach. The next 3 weeks took on a different quality. In the evenings, after supper was cleared, Wes would put on his better boots and hold out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Rowan?" She would laugh and take his hand, and he would hum tunelessly as they moved around the small cabin, practicing basic steps. He was right about having 2 left feet at first, but he improved with practice, growing more confident in leading her through turns. "You're getting better," she told him one evening after he'd successfully navigated a complete dance without stepping on her feet. "Good teacher," he replied, spinning her carefully in the narrow space between table and stove. These practice sessions became something she looked forward to, a bright spot in the routine of days. The casual touch of dancing his hand on her waist. Her hand in his broke down the careful physical distance they'd maintained. Not inappropriate, but warming, a gradual thawing of boundaries. 2 days before the dance, Annalise spent the afternoon altering her dress. It needed little work. She'd made it well, but she adjusted the hem and took in the waist slightly. She'd lost weight since arriving, the physical work and worry taking their toll. She was pressing the final seams when Wes knocked on her doorframe. "Package came for you at Morrison's. He sent it out with Jake." Confused, she took the brown paper parcel. Inside was a length of ivory lace, fine and delicate, perfect for a collar. A small card read, "For your dress. Every woman needs something new for a dance. Baboo." "Wes, this is too much." "It's lace, not gold. Morrison's wife helped me pick it out. Said it would suit." She held up the lace, seeing immediately how it would soften the neckline of her dress. "It's beautiful, but why?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with gratitude. "You're brave enough to face the town. Figured you should have something special when you do it." That evening, she sewed the lace carefully onto the dress, each stitch a small act of hope. When she tried it on, the woman in the mirror looked almost elegant. The dress skimmed her tall frame gracefully, the green bringing out the amber in her eyes. She would never be petite or delicate, but perhaps she could be handsome in her own way. The night of the dance arrived crisp and clear. Annalise dressed carefully, pinning her hair in a style that was fashionable but secure. Her hands shook slightly as she fastened her mother's small pearl earrings, the only jewelry she owned. When she emerged from her room, Wes was waiting in his best clothes, clean black pants, white shirt, and a vest she'd never seen before. He'd trimmed his beard and his boots were polished to a shine. He looked, she realized with a flutter, quite handsome. He stared at her for a long moment, then cleared his throat. That dress suits you." "Thank you. You clean up well yourself." He offered his arm formally. "Shall we, Miss Rowan?" The ride to town was quiet, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the meeting hall, Annalise could hear music and laughter spilling out into the night. Lanterns lined the path, and couples moved inside the bright windows. "Second thoughts?" Wes asked quietly. "Third and fourth thoughts," she admitted. "But I'm still going in." "That's my girl." The endearment slipped out naturally, and they both pretended not to notice. Inside, the hall was warm and crowded. As they entered, conversations gradually stopped, heads turning to stare. Annalise felt every eye, heard the whispers start immediately. She kept her chin up, her hand steady on Wes's arm. "Let them look," he murmured. "We've got nothing to be ashamed of." They made their way to the refreshment table, where Mrs. Morrison greeted them with genuine warmth. "Miss Rowan, how lovely you look. That lace sets off the dress perfectly." "Thank you. It was very thoughtful." Annalise managed a smile. Gradually, The initial shock of their appearance wore off, and conversations resumed. A few ranchers' wives nodded politely. Some of the cowboys who'd brought mending to her touched their hats in greeting. Not everyone was friendly, but enough were civil to ease the tension in her shoulders. When the fiddle struck up a new tune, Wes turned to her. "May I have this dance?" In front of everyone, especially in front of everyone. She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the floor. For a moment, standing there in the center of the room, she felt exposed and vulnerable. She was taller than most of the men present, certainly taller than any other woman. In Wes's arms, though, the difference seemed less stark. He was tall enough that she could rest her hand comfortably on his shoulder, broad enough that she didn't feel oversized. "Remember," he said quietly, "just like we practiced, I lead, you follow, and we ignore everyone else." The music began, and they moved together. His steps were careful but confident, and she found herself relaxing into the familiar rhythm. Around them, other couples danced, but she was aware only of Wes, his hand warm on her waist, his eyes steady on hers. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "So are you. Hardly any left feet at all." He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Must be the company." They danced 3 dances in a row, lost in their own world. It wasn't until the music paused that Annalise realized people were watching them with something other than mockery. There was surprise there, yes, but also a grudging respect. They made a striking couple, both tall, both strong, moving together with unexpected grace. When they finally sat down to rest, several people approached. Tom Baker, whose coat she'd mended, asked about having work shirts made. His wife, emboldened, inquired about a winter dress. By the end of the evening, Annalise had several potential commissions and the promise of steady mending work.
"See?"
Wes said as they prepared to leave.
"Not so bad."
"No," she agreed, surprised to find it true.
"Not bad at all."
As they were gathering their coats, Marcus Dalton appeared. Annalise stiffened, but Wes's hand on her back steadied her. "Calder," Dalton said stiffly, then nodded to Annalise. "Miss Rowan."
"Mr. Dalton,"
she replied evenly. He shifted uncomfortably.
"I hear you're doing seamstress work now."
"My wife might have some mending. She can bring it by the north cabin," Wes said before Annalise could respond. "Miss Rowan's established quite a business." Dalton's jaw tightened at the subtle rebuke, but he nodded and moved away. Annalise let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding.
"Thank you,"
she said quietly. "No need. You'd have handled him fine on your own." Outside, the night air was cold and clear. As Wes helped her into the wagon, his hands lingered for a moment at her waist. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, acknowledgement of the evening's success, perhaps, or something deeper. On the ride home, Annalise found herself humming the last tune they danced to. Beside her, Wes smiled and picked up the melody, their voices blending in the darkness. "We should do this again," he said as the cabin came into view. "The dancing or the facing down the town gossips?"
"Both.
"Either, whatever you're willing." She thought about the evening, the initial fear, the gradual acceptance, the unexpected joy of dancing in his arms. Most of all, she thought about how right it had felt, being seen with him, being claimed as his companion for the evening.
"I'm willing,"
she said softly.
"For both."
The storm hit 3 days after the dance, rolling in from the north with a fury that turned the world white. Annalise woke to howling wind and the cabin creaking under the assault. Through her small window, she could see nothing but swirling snow. She dressed quickly and hurried to the main room. The stove was already burning hot. But Wes wasn't there. His coat was gone from its peg, his boots missing from their place by the door. On the table lay a note. "Checking stock. Stay inside. Back soon. W." Soon, but when was it written? The paper was cold to the touch. She forced herself through the morning routine, stoking the fire, making coffee, preparing breakfast that grew cold on the table. By noon, with no sign of him, worry had transformed into fear. The storm showed no signs of letting up. If anything, it had grown worse. Visibility through the window was perhaps 10 feet. She paced the small cabin, arguments warring in her mind. He'd told her to stay inside, sensible advice in a blizzard, but he'd also said, back soon, and it had been hours. The stock were in the north pasture, she knew, near the tree line where they could shelter. But that was a good mile from the cabin, through open ground. By mid-afternoon, she couldn't stand it anymore. She pulled on her heaviest clothes wool dress, 2 shawls, her father's old work coat she'd brought from Illinois. She wrapped her face in a muffler, leaving only her eyes exposed, and tucked matches and a knife into her pockets. If she was going to do something foolish, at least she'd be prepared. She fashioned a rope guide from the cabin to the barn, then from the barn toward the north pasture, tying it to fence posts where she could find them. The wind tried to knock her down with every step, and the cold bit through her layers like teeth. But she pressed on, following the fence line by feel when she couldn't see. Wesley called her. She muttered through numb lips. If you're not frozen solid, I'm going to kill you myself. She almost missed him, a dark shape against the base of a cottonwood, nearly covered by drifting snow. Her heart stopped, then resumed at double pace as the shape moved slightly. Wes! She dropped to her knees beside him. He was conscious but barely, his lips blue with cold. Beside him, wrapped in his coat, was a newborn calf, still wet from birth. Couldn't leave it, he managed through chattering teeth. Damn died, too cold. You impossible man. She was crying and didn't care. Can you stand? Together, with her supporting most of his weight, they struggled upright. She wrapped her outer shawl around the calf, then focused on getting them moving. Every step was agony. Wes stumbling, the calf bleeding weakly. The rope guide saved them without it. They'd have been lost in the white void. The barn first, where she deposited the calf in a heap of straw. Then the final stretch to the cabin. Wes's weight growing heavier as his strength failed. She half carried, half dragged him the last few yards, tumbling through the door in a cascade of snow. No time for propriety. She stripped his frozen outer clothes with shaking hands, alarmed by how cold his skin felt. His fingers were white at the tip's frostbite, though hopefully not severe. She wrapped him in every blanket she could find and stoked the stove until it glowed. Talk to me, she commanded, rubbing his hands between hers. Stay awake. Bossy, he mumbled, but his eyes focused on her face. You came. Told you. Stay inside. Since when do I take orders? She moved to his feet, pulling off boots and socks. More white patches. She bit her lip hard to keep from crying again. This is going to hurt when the feeling comes back. Already hurts. His voice was stronger, though. More present. The calf. In the barn. We'll check on it when you're not half frozen. She filled basins with lukewarm water, not hot. That would damage the tissue more. Hands first. He hissed as his fingers entered the water but didn't pull away. She knelt beside him, keeping his hands submerged, watching color slowly return. The intimacy of the moment, her hands supporting his, their heads close together, would have embarrassed her once. Now all that mattered was bringing him back from the edge. Why? She asked quietly. Why risk yourself for one calf? He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, Emma loved the calves. Every spring, she'd name them all. Even though I told her not to get attached, she'd have tried to save it too. She'd have wanted her father alive more than any calf saved. Maybe? He flexed his fingers experimentally, wincing. But I saw it there, new and shivering, its mother already stiff. Couldn't just leave it. She understood then. It wasn't about the calf. Not really. It was about fighting back against loss, about saving what could be saved in a world that took so much. Your turn, she said, moving the basin to his feet.
This will be worse.
It was. He gritted his teeth as circulation returned, the pain of thawing almost worse than freezing. She stayed with him through it, talking about anything she could think of her brother's misadventures, recipes she wanted to try, plans for spring planting, anything to distract from the pain. Finally, when color had returned to all extremities and he'd stopped shivering, she helped him to his bed. He protested, but weakly. "Rest," she commanded. "I'll check the calf and heat some soup." "Annalise." He caught her hand as she turned to go. "Thank you." "Thank me by not doing anything this foolish again." But she squeezed his hand before releasing it. The storm continued through the night. She checked on Wes every hour, relieved to find him sleeping naturally. His color improved. The calf, miraculously, survived too. She fed it warm milk mixed with molasses, and it sucked eagerly at the bottle, will to live strong despite its rough start. By morning, the storm had blown itself out, leaving crystal clear skies and snowdrifts up to the windows. Wes emerged from his room, moving stiffly but determined to help with chores.
Absolutely not,
Annalise said firmly.
You nearly died yesterday. You're staying by the fire if I have to tie you to the chair.
I'm fine. You're lucky you still have all your fingers and toes. Don't push that luck. She handed him coffee and pointed to the chair. Sit. I can manage the essential chores. He sat, but she could see it chafed him to be idle.
At least let me help with...
No. You're awfully commanding for hired help, he grumbled, but there was warmth in his eyes. Good thing I'm not hired help anymore then. Partners. Remember, and partners don't let partners freeze to death over livestock, no matter how noble the intention. She spent the morning digging paths to essential buildings, checking the horses, hauling water. The work was hard, but she was strong, and anger at his near loss gave her extra energy. When she returned, she found him at the table sketching plans for a better shelter in the north pasture. For next time, he said, not meeting her eyes. There better not be a next time. She hung up her wet things and moved to check his hands. The frost-bitten areas were red now, painful looking but healing. These need salve. She fetched the tin of medicinal salve and began applying it carefully to the damaged skin. He sat very still, and she became aware again of the intimacy, her hands gentle on his, the warm cabin cocooning them from the frozen world outside. I was terrified, she admitted quietly. When you didn't come back.
I'm sorry. Didn't think...
No, you didn't. She looked up at him then, letting him see the fear and anger and relief in her eyes. You didn't think about what it would do to me if something happened to you. How I'd manage? Yes, but more. How I'd feel. He turned his hand in hers, palm to palm. How would you feel? The question hung between them, heavy with meaning. She could deflect, return to safe ground, or she could be as brave as she'd been walking into that blizzard. Like the world had gotten colder than any storm could make it, she said simply. His fingers tightened on hers. Annalise, I'm not asking for anything, she continued quickly. I know you're still, that you lost. I'm not asking, just telling you that you matter, that you can't go risking yourself without thinking of that. You matter too. His voice was rough. When I was out there, getting colder, all I could think was that I'd told you to stay inside, that at least you were safe and warm. It helped. She finished applying the salve and began wrapping his hands lightly with clean cloth. We're a pair. Aren't we both too stubborn to let the other one freeze? Good match that way. He agreed. The words settled between them like a promise. Undefined, but understood. Something had shifted during the storm. Barriers swept away like snow before wind. Not a declaration. Not yet. But an acknowledgement that what existed between them was more than convenience or friendship. That evening, as she prepared supper, Wes insisted on helping despite his bandaged hands. They worked together with the ease of long practice, dancing around each other in the small space. When she reached over him for a plate, he caught her waist to steady her, and the touch lingered a moment longer than necessary. After supper, she brought the calf in to warm by the stove. It was stronger now, standing on wobbly legs, investigating its new world with curious eyes. "Still needs a name," Wes observed.
"I thought you didn't name livestock." "Special circumstances. Near-death experiences change the rules."
She considered the calf a little heifer with a white star on her forehead. Hope, she decided, because that's what saving her was about. Hope, he agreed. Good name. They sat by the fire, the calf between them, and Annalise felt a contentment she hadn't expected to find again. Outside, the world was frozen and harsh, but inside, warmed by fire and companionship and something deeper that didn't yet have a name. Life was good. "No more heroics," she said firmly. "Promise me." "No more unnecessary heroics," he amended. "Can't promise more than that out here." She supposed that would have to do. In this hard land, with its unforgiving winters and uncertain springs, you took what promises you could get and held them close against the cold. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, paths to clear, stock to tend, the eternal battle against winter's grip. But tonight, with Wes safe beside her and Hope sleeping by the stove, Annalise allowed herself to believe in the possibility of spring. Spring came slowly to the prairie, first in small signs, patches of bare ground, the sound of water running beneath ice, the return of birdsong at dawn. With it came the busiest season on the ranch, and with that, increased trips to town for supplies. Annalise had grown comfortable with these excursions, no longer shrinking from the stares and whispers. Her mending business had expanded into dressmaking, and she had regular customers now, but comfort bred carelessness, and she hadn't noticed how the talk had shifted until Mrs. Henderson cornered her at Morrison's store. "It's simply not proper, dear," the older woman said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false concern. "An unmarried woman living with a man, even in separate quarters. People are beginning to wonder about your arrangement." "People have been wondering since I arrived," Annalise replied evenly, selecting thread from the display. "Yes, but that was different. You were newly arrived, in distress. Wes was being charitable, but it's been months now, and still you remain unchaperoned. It gives the wrong impression." "And what impression would that be?" Annalise's voice had gone dangerously quiet. "Mrs. Henderson lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Well, dear, men have needs, and a woman who would live in such circumstances, people naturally assume." "That's enough." Wes's voice cut through the store like a blade. Neither woman had heard him enter. He stood in the doorway, his face carved from stone. "Mr. Calder, Mrs. Henderson fluttered. "I was simply expressing concern." "You were spreading poison and calling it concern." He moved to stand beside Annalise, not touching but unmistakably allied. "Miss Rowan works for room and board, nothing more or less. She's shown this town more grace than it's shown her, and I'll not stand by while gossips try to tear her down." "I never meant—" "Yes, you did." His voice was quiet but firm. "And so does everyone else whispering behind their hands. Well, let me make something clear to you and anyone else who cares to listen." The store had gone silent, other customers pretending to shop while hanging on every word. "Annalise Rowan is the finest woman I know. She works harder than any two men, asks for nothing she hasn't earned, and has more dignity in her little finger than most folks manage in a lifetime. If this town had any sense, it would be grateful she chose to stay instead of trying to drive her out with ugly talk." "Mrs. Henderson's face had gone red. "Mr. Calder, your defense of the woman is admirable, but it only reinforces—" "What? That I respect her, that I won't stand by while people who should know better act like vultures." He looked around the store, meeting every curious eye. Yes, Miss Rowan lives at my cabin, in her own room, with her own entrance. She keeps my house and mends your clothes and asks nothing from anyone but honest pay for honest work, if that offends your delicate sensibilities. Perhaps you should examine why you're so eager to think the worst of people." He turned to Annalise. "Are you finished with your shopping?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. He took her basket, paid Morrison without another word, and escorted her out. Behind them, the store erupted in whispered conversation. They rode in silence for several minutes before Annalise spoke. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did." His knuckles were white on the reins. "I'm tired of it. Tired of them looking at you like you're something less than you are." "They'll talk more now. Say you're too defensive, that there must be truth to their suspicions. Let them talk." He glanced at her. Unless it bothers you. What they're saying. What bothers me is what it might do to you. Your reputation, your standing." "My reputation?" He actually laughed, though it was bitter. "I'm a hired hand who argued with his boss and lives like a hermit. What reputation?" "You're a good man. People respect you, even if they don't say it. And you're a good woman. That should be enough." He was quiet for a moment. "But it's not, is it not in towns like this?" They rode on, each lost in thought. The confrontation had stripped away the comfortable fiction they'd been living that their arrangement was purely practical, that the town would eventually accept it. The truth was messier, more complicated. That evening, Annalise was quieter than usual. She served supper and started to retreat to her room, but Wes stopped her. "Wait, we need to talk about this." She sat reluctantly. "What's to talk about? People think what they think. What if we gave them something else to think?" She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" He took a breath, seeming to gather courage. "I mean, what if it wasn't just a business arrangement? What if we made it official?" "Official?" Her heart was suddenly racing. "I'm not saying. I know you came here for marriage and got disappointment instead. I'm not Marcus Dalton, promising something I can't deliver. But maybe we could have something real, based on what we've built these months." "Wes." "Hear me out." He leaned forward, earnest. "I care for you, Annalise, more than I expected to care for anyone again. It's not the lightning strike love poets write about. It's quieter, steadier, like finding solid ground after years of shifting sand." She felt tears prick her eyes. "And you think marriage would solve the gossip?" "I think marriage would be honest. We live like partners already. We work together, plan together, worry about each other. The only thing missing is the paper that makes it official." "And sharing a bed." The words slipped out before she could stop them. He flushed but met her eyes steadily. "That would be your choice. Always. I'm offering partnership, companionship, protection from gossip. Anything else? That's for you to decide if and when you're ready. You're proposing a marriage of convenience like what I came here for originally." "No." His voice was firm. "I'm proposing a marriage of choice. I choose you, knowing exactly who you are. The question is whether you choose me." She stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted the prairie gold. Such a different view from the one she'd expected to have as Mrs. Marcus Dalton. "I need to think," she said finally. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He stood as well, suddenly awkward. "I'll be checking the horses." Alone, Annalise sank back into the chair. Marriage to Wes. Not the business arrangement she'd originally sought, but not quite a love match either. Something in between, built on mutual respect and growing affection. She thought about his defense of her in the store, fierce and unwavering. Thought about winter evenings by the fire, easy conversation over mending. Thought about how her heart had stopped when she'd found him half frozen in the snow. When had Wes Calder become essential to her happiness? Not in a dramatic moment, but in 1,000 small ones, his smile over morning coffee, his careful attention when she spoke, the way he said her name like it was something precious. She found him in the barn, brushing down the horses with mechanical precision. He looked up when she entered, but didn't speak. "Yes," she said simply. He stilled. "Yes. Yes, I choose you, but I have conditions." A smile tugged at his mouth. "Of course you do." "We go slow. We build on what we have. No rushing into anything either of us isn't ready for."
Agreed.
And we're honest with each other, always, about doubts, fears, hopes, all of it.
I can do that. And
She took a breath.
you teach me about the ranch. Real teaching. I want to be a true partner, not just in name.
I'd like nothing better. He set down the brush, moving closer. Anything else?
Just one thing. She met his eyes. This isn't about the gossip for me. I want you to know that it's about choosing the life I want instead of the one I thought I had to have.
He reached out, taking her hand carefully.
For me too. The gossip just forced me to speak what I've been feeling for weeks.
They stood there in the barn, hand in hand, as the sun set behind them. It wasn't a romantic scene from a novel. They were both dusty from the day's work, surrounded by horses and hay, but it was real and honest, and theirs.
When?
She asked. Soon as possible. Town's already talking, might as well give them something true to discuss. He squeezed her hand. If that's all right with you. Tomorrow. He blinked.
That's very soon. Wes called her. I traveled across 3 states to marry a stranger. At least with you. I know what I'm getting. She smiled. Besides, why give them more time to gossip?
Tomorrow, then, he agreed, looking slightly dazed. I'll ride to town first thing. Arrange it with Reverend Mills.
And I'll finish that dress I've been working on.
Might as well look presentable for my second attempt at marriage. You always look presentable, he said softly. More than presentable. She felt heat rise in her cheeks, but didn't look away. This was new territory for them, the permission to speak feelings aloud, to acknowledge attraction alongside affection. That night, she lay awake thinking about the strangeness of life. She'd come west to marry a man she didn't know for practical reasons. Now she was marrying a man she knew well for reasons that were both practical and something more. Not passionate love, perhaps, but deep caring, respect, trust, the knowledge that he saw her truly and valued what he saw. In his room, she could hear Wes moving about, probably as sleepless as she was. Tomorrow would change everything and nothing. They would still work side by side, still share quiet evenings, still be themselves, but they would do it as husband and wife, chosen and choosing. She rose and went to her trunk, pulling out her journal. By lamplight, she wrote. Tomorrow I marry Wes Calder. Not because I must, not because I have no other choice, but because I want to. Because somewhere between that first night in the barn and tonight in the same barn, I found something I didn't know I was looking for. Not a fairy tale, not a rescue, but a partnership. A man who defends my honor while respecting my strength, who offers marriage not to save me, but to stand beside me. The town will talk. Let them. We will build our life word by word, day by day, choice by choice. And maybe that's the greatest love story, not the lightning strike, but the slow dawn. Not the rescue, but the recognition. 2 people choosing each other, again and again, in all weather. She closed the journal and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would come soon enough, bringing with it a new chapter. Tonight, she would rest in the certainty of her choice and the quiet joy of being chosen in return. The wedding was set for the following week. Reverend Mills had been unable to accommodate them immediately, much to the delight of the town gossips who had 7 days to speculate. Word spread quickly, as it always did in Dust Creek, and opinions were divided between those who thought it about time and those who suspected ulterior motives. During those days of waiting, a new tension filled the cabin. Not unpleasant, but charged with awareness. Wes and Annalise moved around each other with exaggerated courtesy, both conscious that everything was about to change. Their evening conversations continued, but now their hands would accidentally touch over the mending, and neither would pull away immediately. 3 days before the wedding, Wes was working on fence repairs in the south pasture when his hammer slipped. Catching his thumb, he came in cursing under his breath, blood dripping from the wound.
Let me see,
Annalise demanded, guiding him to a chair. It's nothing. It's not nothing if you can't work. She examined the damage, a deep gash that would need tending. As she cleaned and wrapped it, she was acutely aware of their closeness, of his breath stirring her hair as she bent over his hand. This is becoming a habit, he said softly. You patching me up. Someone has to keep you in one piece. She tied off the bandage, but didn't immediately release his hand. Try to be more careful. I'd prefer my groom to have all his fingers for the ceremony. I'll do my best. He turned his hand in hers, palm up, and traced a callus on her thumb. You have working hands too, strong hands. Not very feminine, I've been told. By fools. His voice was firm. These hands have mended my clothes, cooked my meals, helped save my life in a blizzard. I wouldn't trade them for all the delicate fingers in the world. She felt tears threaten and blinked them back. Even now, days from their wedding, such simple acceptance of who she was could still undo her. That evening, as she worked on finishing her wedding dress, a practical blue wool that would serve for both ceremony and everyday wear after Wes cleared his throat. I've been thinking about arrangements after we're married. She looked up from her stitching. Oh, the lean-tos served you well, but it's small, and winter's coming again. I thought, that is, if you're agreeable, you could have the main room, the addition. I can take the lean-to. You want to give up your bedroom? It's larger, more comfortable. You deserve... Wes, she set down her sewing. We're getting married. Married people typically share a bedroom. His face flushed. I told you, that would be your choice. When you're ready, if you're ever ready. I don't want you to feel obligated. I know. She picked up her needle again, focusing on the careful stitches to avoid his eyes. And I appreciate that, but perhaps we could start with sharing the space. If not, everything else. The addition is big enough for two. We could put up a curtain for privacy if needed. You'd be comfortable with that. She thought about the lean-to, cold despite the small stove. Thought about the symbolism of maintaining separate spaces, as if their marriage was something to hide. More comfortable than keeping apart like we have something to be ashamed of. All right, he agreed quietly. If you're sure. The day before the wedding, Annalise made her usual trip to town for supplies. She expected stares and whispers, but not Mrs. Dalton waiting by Morrison's counter. Miss Rowan. The older woman's face was carefully neutral. I heard about your upcoming nuptials. Mrs. Dalton, Annalise nodded politely. Waiting? I wanted to apologize for my husband's behavior when you arrived. It was ungentlemanly. Annalise blinked, surprised. Thank you. And to say, Mrs. Dalton seemed to struggle with the words. Wes Calder is a good man, better than he's sometimes given credit for. You could do much worse. I couldn't do better, Annalise said firmly. Something shifted in the older woman's face. Perhaps respect, perhaps regret. No, I don't believe you could. Good day, Miss Rowan, and best wishes. After she left, Morrison leaned over the counter. That was something. Eleanor Dalton apologizing to anyone, let alone... He caught himself. Well, that was something. That evening, Annalise recounted the encounter to Wes, who listened with raised eyebrows. Eleanor Dalton has a good heart under all that propriety, he said finally. Probably knows her husband was wrong, but couldn't say so directly. It was kind of her. Worlds full of kindness. Sometimes you just have to look harder for it. He paused at the door to the addition. Speaking of which, I moved some things around, made space if you want to bring your things over. She followed him into the room. He'd rearranged everything, creating clear spaces one side of the room for him, one for her. A new curtain rod was installed across the middle. Though no curtain hung yet, her trunk would fit perfectly in the corner he'd cleared. "It's perfect," she said softly. "We'll make it work." He seemed suddenly nervous. "Whatever we need to do to make it work, we will." Their wedding day dawned clear and warm. One of those perfect autumn days that made the prairie gold. Annalise dressed carefully in her new blue dress, pinning her mother's cameo at her throat. Her hands shook only a little as she arranged her hair. When she emerged from the lean-to her last morning there, Wes was waiting in his best clothes, a small bouquet of late wildflowers in his hand. "Thought you should have flowers," he said, offering them awkwardly. "They're not much." "They're perfect." She breathed in their subtle scent. "How do I look?" "Beautiful." The word came out reverent. "You always look beautiful to me." The ride to town was quiet, both lost in thought. As they approached the church, Annalise saw a small crowd gathered, some curious, some genuinely welcoming. "Mrs." Morrison stood at the front with several other women who'd become regular customers. Jake and several ranch hands had cleaned up and come to witness. Inside the simple church, Reverend Mills waited with a kind smile. As Wes and Annalise stood before him, she felt a moment of déjà vu. Hadn't she imagined this scene on the journey west? But in her imagination, she'd been standing next to a stranger, hoping for tolerance. Now she stood beside Wes, whose hand was warm and steady in hers, who knew her strengths and failures and chose her anyway. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional. But when Wes said, "I do," his voice carried such certainty that her breath caught. And when her turn came, the words felt like a declaration of independence, as much as dependence choosing her life rather than accepting what was given. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Mills announced. Wes hesitated, then leaned down to brush his lips against hers, soft, respectful, but with a promise of more when she was ready. The small congregation applauded, and suddenly people were surrounding them with congratulations. Even Mrs. Henderson approached, her smile tight but present. "I hope you'll be very happy," she said, the words sounding rehearsed. "We will be," Annalise replied with certainty that seemed to surprise the older woman. The ride home was different, charged with new awareness. They were married, husband and wife. The weight of it, the possibility of it, hung between them like morning mist. "Any regrets?" Wes asked as the cabin came into view. "None. You?" "Only that I didn't speak sooner." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist. "Mrs. Calder." "Mr. Calder," she replied, smiling at the sound of it. Inside, she found he'd made efforts wildflowers in a jar on the table, the good dishes laid out, even a cake from Morrison's store. "When did you do all this?" "This morning, before you woke. Wanted it to be special." "It is." She turned to him, suddenly overwhelmed. "It's all special. I'm your husband," he finished softly. "And you're my wife. We'll figure out what that means together." That evening, after a quiet supper and cake that was too sweet but perfect for the occasion, Annalise moved her belongings into the addition. Wes helped, carrying her trunk, hanging her dresses beside his shirts. The domesticity of it, their things mingling. Sharing space made it real in a way the ceremony hadn't quite managed. As night fell, they prepared for bed with exaggerated casualness. Annalise changed into her nightgown behind the curtain he'd strung up, while he turned down the oil lamp and stoked the fire. When she emerged, he was already in bed, carefully on his side. She slipped under the quilts on her side, acutely aware of the space between them, not much in the narrow bed, but carefully maintained. "Good night, wife," he said softly in the darkness. "Good night, husband," she replied. They lay quietly, each aware of the other's breathing. Then, impulsively, Annalise reached across the space between them. Finding his hand, he laced his fingers with hers, and they fell asleep that way, connected but respectful, married but still learning what that meant. Outside, the prairie wind sang its ancient song, and if the night listened closer to the cabin than before, neither of them minded. They had chosen each other. In full daylight and clear conscience, everything else would come in time. 3 months had passed since their wedding, and winter had settled over the prairie like a familiar friend. The cabin that had once echoed with Wes's solitude now hummed with the quiet rhythms of shared life. They had found their way into marriage gradually, like water finding its course naturally, without force. This evening was like many others. Snow fell softly outside while Annalise worked on mending one of Wes's shirts. But her hands were distracted, her stitches less precise than usual. She had something to tell him, something that would change everything again. Wes sat across from her, oiling a harness, but she could feel him watching her. He'd always been observant, but marriage had sharpened his awareness of her moods. "Something on your mind?" he asked finally. She set down the needle, meeting his eyes. "I've been thinking about the future, our future." He put aside the harness, giving her his full attention. These months had taught them both the value of really listening to each other. "What about it? About what we're building here? It's good. What we have. Better than I dreamed when I stepped off that freight wagon." She smiled at the memory, though it had been painful then. "But I wonder sometimes if you're truly happy. If this is enough." "Enough." He leaned forward. "Annalise, these past months have been the best I've known in years. Coming home to you, working beside you, just being with you. How could that not be enough? Even though we haven't—" She gestured vaguely at their sleeping arrangement. They still shared the bed, but carefully, like friends rather than lovers. They held hands, exchanged gentle kisses, but had gone no further. She'd been waiting to feel ready, and he'd been patiently honoring that. "We have what we have," he said firmly. "And it's good. When you're ready for more, I'll be here. If you're never ready, I'll still be here. That's what I promised." Her eyes filled with tears. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You showed up," he said simply. "You stayed. You made this empty cabin into a home. You looked at me and saw someone worth choosing. That's everything. Annalise." She stood then, moving around the table to stand before him. He looked up at her, and she cupped his weathered face in her hands. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier than she'd expected. Not the way I thought love would feel, all drama and desperation, but steady and sure, like sunrise, like coming home. His hands covered hers. "I love you too, have for longer than I probably should admit." She laughed softly. "We're quite a pair, taking the long way around to everything. Best journeys usually do take the long way." He stood, drawing her into his arms. "No need to rush now either." She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Actually, about that, I think we might need to rush a little on some things." He pulled back to look at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean we should probably work on expanding the cabin come spring. Maybe add a room? Somewhere. Smaller. For someone small." Understanding dawned in his eyes slowly, like light breaking over the mountains. "Annalise, are you—" 3 months along, near as I can figure." She watched joy and wonder and a touch of fear chase across his face. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." "A baby." He said it like a prayer. "Our baby." "Our baby," she confirmed. "Due in summer. If my counting's right. Is this all right?"
I know we haven't talked about children. And with Emma, he silenced her with a kiss, deeper than their usual careful exchanges. When they parted, both were breathless. All right, Annalise, it's a miracle, a gift I never thought I'd have again. He pressed his hand gently to her still flat stomach. Our child, born from choice, from love. How could that be anything but perfect? They stood there in the lamplight, holding each other, adjusting to this new future taking shape between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin was warm with possibility. We'll need to prepare, Annalise said, ever practical. Baby clothes to make, a cradle to build. Tomorrow, Wes interrupted. Tonight, just let me hold you and be grateful. They moved to the bedroom, their bedroom, truly theirs now in every sense. As they prepared for bed, there was a new tenderness between them, a deeper intimacy born of shared joy. I was so scared when I first came here, Annalise said as they lay together, his arms around her, her back pressed to his chest. Rejected and alone, hiding in a barn, I thought my life was over. It was just beginning, he murmured against her hair. We both were. Yes, she agreed. We were becoming who we were meant to be, together. They were quiet for a while, listening to the wind and thinking their own thoughts. Then Annalise spoke again. I want our child to know their story, all of it. How their mother came west to marry a stranger and found their father instead. How their father opened his home to someone in need and found love he didn't expect. How we chose each other, again and again. They'll know, Wes promised. They'll know they were wanted, planned for, loved before they even existed. They'll know their parents built something real together, something worth having. And they'll know, Annalise added softly, that sometimes the best things come from the hardest moments, that being rejected by one person can lead you to exactly where you belong. As if in agreement, the wind died down outside, leaving the night peaceful and still. The cabin that had sheltered a frightened woman in a barn, that had seen tentative friendship bloom into steady love, settled around them like a blessing. Annalise turned in Wes's arms to face him. No more sleeping like strangers, she said decisively. We're having a child together. It's time we truly lived like the married couple we are. Are you sure? Ever careful of her, ever respectful. I've never been more sure of anything. She kissed him then, with all the love and desire she'd been holding back. I choose you, Wesley Calder. Tonight and every night, in all weather, in all seasons, forever. And I choose you, Annalise Calder, he replied, drawing her closer. My wife, my partner, mother of my child, forever. Outside, the moon rose full and bright, casting silver light across the snow-covered prairie. But inside the cabin, there was only warmth and love and the quiet joy of two people who had found their way home to each other. The woman who had once chosen a barn to sleep in, alone and rejected, now chose to open her heart completely. And the cowboy who had opened his cabin to a stranger opened his soul to love again. Together, they faced the future, not the one they'd planned, but the one they'd built with patience and courage and grace. And the night, as it always had, leaned in to listen to their story, a tale of choosing and being chosen, of love found in unexpected places, of home built not from promises made to strangers, but from the daily choice to see and value and cherish the person beside you. In a cabin on the prairie, two hearts beat as one, and a third tiny heartbeat joined their rhythm. The story that began with rejection had become a song of belonging. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon, wild and free and unashamed, just like the love that filled the small cabin, making it larger than any mansion, warmer than any fire, stronger than any storm. This was their ending and their beginning, chosen and choosing, loved and loving, home at last. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope it touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it with you.
I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts on Annalise and Wes's journey. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit the like button. And if you really want to help more people discover these tales of courage and love from the American frontier, please hit that hype button. Your support means the world and helps these stories reach more listeners who appreciate authentic historical romance. Until next time, keep riding toward your own sunset.